Hey guys, welcome to Enabled. This video is part 2 of the PS4 controller that we've been working on and you've seen in several different videos. This will be the final video for this controller and I'm going to show you how to put it all together. So we've walked through buttons, joysticks, we've walked through the analog sticks, and now we're going to put it all together and I'm going to show you the box and how to wire it. I kind of speed through this one because I'm anxious to move on to a modular design, and those are going to be a whole new set of videos that's going to make this controller obsolete. But I think this is going to help everybody understand how it works. You'll see how simple it is and hopefully inspire some ideas from you. One thing I will note is I did not focus any on the analog joysticks in this video, and that's because I go through great detail on getting those analog joysticks to work in another video, so check that one out if you want to see how the analog sticks work. There's a lot more to it than the regular click type joysticks that we discussed in this video, and I will have follow-on videos when we go to the modular design. We'll bring those analog controllers back and we'll look more into detail again later on. So if you're wondering where that information is, check out another video where I talk about that. Other than that, enjoy. The first thing you need to do when you're building a controller like this is decide which buttons and joysticks that you want to use, because the buttons could be different sizes depending on which you choose, which I talked about earlier, and also the joysticks that you use could have different mounting provisions, like I also mentioned earlier. So you need to decide which buttons and joysticks that you want to use in your controller, how many of each that you want, and then go from there. You need to build a box. So I used 1/2-inch plywood, but you could build a box out of anything. You could build out of plastic. You could use a cardboard box if you wanted to be really cheap. You could use an old suitcase. It doesn't matter as long as the box is big enough to handle all of the buttons and joysticks that you want, and it's deep enough to accommodate the depth of the joysticks and mounting of the electronics that you want to mount inside of it. So once you've decided what equipment you're going to use, then you need to decide on the layout that you want for your buttons. Now there's multiple ways of doing this. I draw, when I do this for myself, I draw up everything in CAD and lay it out that way, and then I print it out on paper and stamp it. So this is what my CAD drawing would look like. Now this is for a different joystick that I built, so it's not the same hole pattern and joysticks that you just saw on the wood underneath of this. But this is the idea. I put the joystick layout and the attachment holes for each joystick, and then I put my buttons in here, and I mark the center points for everything that I need. This row right here is the LEDs that I need to put in there. When I get that done, then I lay it out on a piece of plywood, and I take a hammer and a punch and I just punch holes where all my center points would be. And then I go through and I take a drill bit and I drill the size of holes that are needed for each one. So on my drawing I've marked that. I use an 1 1/8" hole for the joystick centers and also the buttons that I used. And then I use 1/4-inch holes for the LEDs, and I believe that's the same size as the attachment holes for the joysticks. But you get the idea. Now you don't have to use CAD. I know there's a learning curve for using CAD, and it can be expensive depending on what kind it is. You don't have to do that at all. You could do it manually. You could measure from point to point if you wanted to, draw it out. You could also create it in Microsoft PowerPoint or Microsoft Word and print it on paper like I just did. Or you can just make little circles and cut them out of paper and lay those out however you want. Tape them on the plywood. That would give you a physical feel of spacing and visuals of how things are going to work. And if you don't like it, then you just untape it and move your circle somewhere else. So there's all kinds of ways to lay this out that's cheap and easy with very minimal tools. Then of course you're going to need some kind of drill and a drill bit. But those are pretty readily available. If you don't have one, then make friends with a neighbor and see if you can borrow one. Go through and drill all your holes, and in the end, this is what it's going to look like. So the size of your plywood, if you're using plywood or whatever box you're putting this in, is really just dependent on personal preference. You could make it much larger, you could make it smaller if you wanted. The smaller you make it, the closer the buttons are going to be. And for our case, that kind of defeats the purpose because we need the buttons spread out enough that Hayden can easily bump them with his fist without accidentally hitting other buttons. And of course, as I mentioned previously, I laid this button layout just so it would be easier to identify the buttons before I had the labels on it. You can lay it out in whatever configuration that you want. It doesn't have to be based on a controller of any kind. If you want to put all your buttons in a line, if that helps you, that works. If you want nothing but joysticks on here, that's another option. So the options are only limited to your imagination. So once you've got the box built, you need something underneath of it as well. So this is the platform that everything attaches to, obviously, but then you need something to house all the wiring and kind of hide it up and hide everything. And you also need to have something to mount your electronics in, which in my case, I'm using the Brook wireless fight board. This is also very simple. I just cut strips of plywood and glued them together. Bob's your uncle, we have a box. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't even have to look pretty. I'm not much of a woodworker. I don't like sanding or anything, so I just cut it, glue it, and call it done. You can get much fancier if you want to. And I might eventually, but for now, that's not happening. Two more features that are needed inside of this. So this is the rough cut hole that I made for the USB adapter that fits in here. And again, this comes with the Brook board. So if you're not using the Brook board, then you don't have to worry about this. But that's really difficult to get in there. But you get the idea. This was a difficult one to do. I just drilled a hole and then I started cutting out until my USB plate fit in there. And then I screwed 2 wood screws in the corners to hold it in place. And last but not least, you need a hole for the antenna to fit through. And I can't remember what size of hole that is. Now this one was a little bit more complicated, unfortunately, because the antenna threads are not long enough to fit through a 1/2 inch plywood, so I did have to carve out like a counter bore on the inside so that I could attach my antenna. It's really designed for thinner panels like thin metal, sheet metal, or thin plastic. But you can get it to work in wood. It's just a little bit more work and you have to carve out the backside. So that's the box. The next thing I'll show you is how to install the buttons, joysticks, and then wire it together. Installing the buttons is incredibly easy. So I've got 2 types of buttons here. The first type of button, you don't have to do anything special. You just remove the nut that it comes with, slide the button down into the hole that you want to install it to, and then reinstall the nut on the back side. Finger tight's okay. If you wanted to use a tool and lightly tighten it, that's also okay. There's no need to get too aggressive with it. The other type of button that I have, I don't remember if the button and the switch come apart, as in 2 pieces, or if it comes together like this. You have to remove this switch in order to get the button in and out. So just kind of twist the switch a little bit and it'll come right out. And then it's the same procedure. You drop it down in the hole and then you tighten the nut on the back side. Then once you've got the nut tightened, you can reinstall the switch. Just like that. Now I'll go ahead and install all the buttons. Once you've figured out the first two, the rest of them are the exact same. So here's what it looks like with all the buttons installed. Now for the joysticks. I'm only going to install one, maybe two of the joysticks just to show you how they attach and how to wire it up, because essentially all the joysticks are the same as far as the wiring is concerned. So each joystick is going to have 4 momentary switches, up, down, left, and right. And then each joystick is also going to mount in a similar way. Now they could have different hole patterns depending on what joystick you choose to use. And wherever you buy your joystick, whoever that is that you bought it from should have a picture or a diagram showing you the hole spacing. So you'll have to use that whenever you make your layout to figure out where to drill your holes. So from the bottom side, of course, you'll have to unscrew the ball top or bat top if the joystick came with one. And that's no big deal. You just take your fingers and you unscrew it. It should come off fairly easily. And then you'll be able to drop your joystick down into the hole. And then I use just some screws that I bought at the hardware store. I think these are number 10 screws, but again, depending on the joystick that you're using, your hole sizes might be a little bit different. And then I put washers on each end so that I could use the same screws for different joysticks, and I also got really long screws so that I could use them for different joysticks. The flange on this joystick is really thin, so I wouldn't need a long screw necessarily for it. But some of the joysticks I have a thicker flange on them, such as this joystick here has a little bit thicker plastic flange, so that's why I went with the longer screws. In the end, it doesn't really matter as long as your screw isn't so long that it hits one of your switch terminals. So all you got to do is put the screw in, put the washer on, and put the nut on. You do that 4 times and your joystick is installed. Wiring. So wiring this thing really isn't difficult at all. I know earlier when we looked at it, there's a lot of wires. It was really messy. It looked really complicated. But it's really not. Here's a better look at the Brook board. Here's a close-up of this guy. You get a diagram with this, but even without the diagram, they have labeled the board on what each of these screw terminals represent. So starting on this end, you have ground, then you have L2, R2, circle, cross, ground, L1, R1, all the way through here. So it tells you which button each one of these screw terminals is. That's really easy. And then all you have to do is run a wire from each one of the buttons or joysticks, depending on what it is that you're wiring, to the board. And then the other side of each button and or joystick switch is ground. And this is a common ground board, which means all the grounds are connected together, which means we can connect all of the grounds on our buttons and joysticks together as well, and only connect one ground to the Brook board. Now, as far as wiring is concerned, There's a few ways that you can go about it. When I built this controller, which was the very first one that I built, I bought wire. This I purchased from Amazon, of course. This is 22 gauge wire with 6 different colors in it. And you can order something like this. Now, if I were to do it again, I would order a smaller wire. I think 24 gauge would be a little bit better. And yes, 24 gauge is smaller than 22 gauge for whatever reason. If you go this route and you want to make all the wires yourself, you can get this bundle of wire. All you have to do is strip the end of it, so you're going to need some wire strippers and some wire cutters. Strip the end off of it. Then you're going to take a wire terminal like this one. So note, there are a couple different sizes of wire terminals. The one on my left hand is bigger than the one on my right hand, and the one you need depends on which buttons and joysticks you're using. So I have 2 different types of buttons in here. One of them requires the smaller one. The other one requires the larger one. So how do you know which one you need? Well, if you take my method, I like to buy 100 of these at a time, then find out that it's the wrong size, and then buy 100 of these instead. Or you can get your buttons and just look at them, and you might be able to tell, hey, that's a smaller one, this is a bigger one. I can definitely tell that because I have the 2 side by side. If this was the first time you've ever done this and you've just got one button type, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. These aren't too terribly expensive though, so if you do mess it up, well, for one thing, you could probably return them if they're wrong. For another thing, you know, it's not going to break the bank if you get it wrong and you have to buy the other size. So strip your wire, put your wire terminal on the end of it, and then you want to crimp it. These actually aren't wire crimping tools. They're wire strippers, but it'll work. And there you go. Now you've got your crimped wire, and then you can put that on one of your buttons, and then that's going to run to your board. So you just strip the other end of it. You can make it however long you want, and then you're going to loosen whatever screw terminal you want that button to be, poke your wire in there, and then tighten down the screw terminal. It's really that easy. And then you do that for every single button. Now, for the ground, what you can do is daisy chain it. So I'm just going to cut this wire as an example, and I'm going to strip one end of each. So I've got the 2 wires here stripped. I'm going to take both of those wires and put into one terminal. And depending on what size of wire you have, you may have to get a larger terminal. So I've got both of those stuck into this terminal. I'm going to crimp it down. And then I'm going to stick that on the other terminal of my switch. Then, instead of running the wires to the board, I'm going to run it to the next switch. So I would keep doing this. I would put 2 wires into one terminal, and then I'd put it in this button. And then I'd have another wire coming out and I'd put 2 wires in it, and I'd put it in the next button. And I would connect all my buttons just like that. And the ones on my joystick. So you've got one for each up, down, left, right. So that's 4. You're going to need 4 grounds. And then you'll have 4 individual wires running to your Brook board for up, down, left, and right. That's one method that you could do. And when I built this controller, that's exactly what I did. I made my own wires and I daisy chained them. You can also do something like this. So rather than putting 2 wires into one terminal, You could make several single wires with terminals on the end of it, and then wind them together with a wire nut. I've done this method several times. The problem with this is it gets messy because you've got several octopuses basically going around, and then you end up with a big nest like I showed earlier. Now the second controller that I built, I spent a little bit more money and I got pre-made daisy chain ground. So you can buy these like this, and you can buy them in the two different sizes, which I have here. So this is the larger size and this is the smaller size. And this is the exact same thing. So there's two wires in one terminal, and it just goes on and on and on. And you can tie each button together. You just keep going down the daisy chain and you plug them together, and you keep doing it until you're out of buttons. Everything's connected, and then you route the very last one to your Brook board. And of course you can cut it at any point, so if this is your stopping point, you don't have any more buttons at that, you just cut it, and then you can run that to your Brook board. That makes it a lot cleaner. It's a lot less time to buy it like this than it is to build it yourself. From here on out, this is what I'm going to do, just because it saves so much time. And I haven't really done a cost comparison. It may be just as cheap. These really aren't that expensive. And by the time you buy the wire yourself and all these screw terminals, it may be a wash, honestly. And then, of course, those are the daisy chains, so this is just the ground. You could do a mix match, so if you wanted to daisy chain the ground and then make your own wires to run to the board, that's probably a realistic option. Or you can buy pre-made wires like this as well. Which I have right here. So this is a pre-made wire, has one terminal on one end, and then on the other end it is just a wire that you can strip, and of course you can cut it to length as needed. You can get these in several different colors, so I've only got 6 colors if I go by my package here. The pre-made ones, there are many more colors than 6, which is really nice. And again, if I do it again, which I did on the second controller, I would probably buy all pre-made wires. It's just very time saving. If you went this route, it might be a little bit more expensive. I don't know, but it was definitely worth it for me. So that's your options as far as wiring. Now I'm not going to wire all of this up because I'm not going to use this. This is just for demonstration purposes. But I think you get the idea. You're just daisy chaining grounds to all your buttons, and then the opposite terminal you're going to run to the Brook board and put it in whatever screw terminal that you want that button or joystick to be. Really, really easy. Now as far as the LEDs are concerned, these are the LEDs that I had hooked up to the system. I got 4 different color of LEDs. I think I got like a box, an assortment of the LEDs, and then I only needed 4 for this controller. The LEDs just come with 2 legs on them. And you have to, or at least the way I did it, is I soldered a wire to each leg. One wire, of course, is ground, and the other wire is positive. So positive and then negative ground. Of course, you can tie all your grounds together because they're going to connect into this board. And the Brook board has a connector like this that plugs into it. That's where your LEDs go. I made this one myself. Again, it takes special tools to make this, and my wire was also too big, so it's come apart. You can see there's only 2 wires attached, and there's supposed to be 5 wires attached. If I were to do this again, I would buy a pre-made wire with the connector already on it, and then I would just solder those to my LEDs as needed. That'll make it a lot cleaner, and you don't have to worry about buying special tools and screwing it up like I did. So that's really it as far as the wiring is concerned. And then the Brook board, I got some of these standoffs I also bought from Amazon, and I'll put links down in the description to all this stuff. And then I just screwed it into my plywood with wood screws. Everything else is pretty straightforward. There's only one place really that you can plug things into the Brook board. So the battery would plug in here. This is USB, obviously. And then the antenna plugs in the back, and there's really only one place to put that. So really straightforward. Whenever I hooked this up the first time, it worked as soon as I powered it on and plugged it into my PC. PC recognized it. It's really easy, straightforward. So hopefully that helps. I almost forgot to mention, earlier I had shown where I had a joystick doing the same thing as 4 buttons. So in my case, on a PS4 controller, I had a joystick operating the X, square, circle, and X buttons, and also buttons doing the exact same thing. So how did I do that? It's actually really straightforward and easy. So I wired up a couple buttons here just to show you. Here are the cluster of buttons that would normally be X, triangle, circle, and square. And then let's just use this joystick as an example that I want to use to do the exact same thing as these buttons. What we're going to do is decide which direction on the joystick we want which button to press. And it's somewhat backwards, and you probably won't be able to notice it on the video so much, but if you had it here in front of you, it gets kind of confusing because it's opposite of what it looks like because you have the whole thing upside down. So I want this button to be the same as pressing up on my joystick. So if I press up on my joystick, the joystick shaft is actually going towards me. So from looking at it, it looks like it's going down. And it's backwards for you guys, so it's even more confusing for me to explain that. But anyway, just trust me, it is confusing, and I've done it wrong a couple different times before I really understood it. So I want this joystick switch to do the same thing as this button. So I've already got it wired up. I've got 2 wires running to it. I just want to attach those buttons together along with a 3rd wire. And I'm going to do that with a wire nut. This is how I did it. Now there's multiple ways that you could tie these wires together, but I'm just going to use a simple gray wire nut. I stick all 3 wires in there, and I'm going to twist the wire nut on. And that's going to leave me with the joystick switch connected to the button switch. And then I've got a 3rd wire coming out, and that 3rd wire is what we're going to run to the Brook board. Pretty easy, right? And then you would do that for every single button. So if you wanted this button to do this direction here, you would tie those together, and then you would have a 3rd wire come in. You attach all 3 wires together with a wire nut, and then you run that 3rd wire to the Brook board for whatever button that you want it to do. Easy peasy. Another thing that I didn't mention, some of these joysticks have multiple poles on them. If you get a joystick that has a multiple pole on it, one of those poles is what they call normally closed, and the other one is normally open. And it'll say either NC for normally closed or NO for normally open. you want to use the NO, the normally open pull. If you use the other one, that's going to be like the button is held down all the time, and you're not going to like that. And then the other pull at the top is ground, and it's always ground. That's consistent between all joysticks and switches with the 3-pull design, or the 2-pull design, really. So anyway, there you go. Alright guys, I know I kind of rushed through this one and I didn't go into as much detail as I normally do, but I just wanted to give you a general understanding of how this works and try and drive home the point that it's not very complicated, especially if you use the Brook board. Now, Brook makes several different types of boards. Again, this one works with PC, PS4, and Nintendo Switch. They also make one for Xbox that works for Xbox and PC. And I think they have, well, I know they have several other versions. However, be warned that only some of them have analog capability. So if you are wanting to use it for like a PS4 or an Xbox, you need something that, or a version of the Brook board that can accommodate analog joysticks. The Brook wireless fight board does that. I think the Xbox One, and I think there's multiple Xbox Ones, so be careful. If you were to buy one, just make sure that you read into it or ask the people at Brook and make sure that it has the analog capability if that's what you're wanting to do. The Brook boards are really made for fight sticks, what they call fight sticks, because people build boxes very similar to this to play fighting games, and they set it up like an arcade style, and it's very competitive. So that's really what these are intended for. And so if you build a fight stick like that, you don't really need the analog capability. They just use regular joysticks like I showed in this video. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to get away from this design altogether, which is why I didn't spend a lot of time on it. I'm going to switch over to a modular design where we can plug in individual buttons and joysticks as needed, and we can rearrange them rather than having them permanently installed in a box like this. So keep a lookout for those videos. I'm going to go into detail, of course, on those, how it works and what I want to do with that controller. Like and subscribe if you learned something today. And hit the bell if you want to keep track of what we're doing in the future. I appreciate you watching. Thanks, guys. Bye.